I'm not sure there's a whole lot to talk about because not a whole lot has happened, but that's my first political comment of the afternoon. So welcome this afternoon. We're here to talk about reauthorization, which I'm going to describe kind of the 30,000 foot level of what that means, and then we can all talk about all the rumors we've been hearing since, to a grand degree, nothing has happened yet. So every 4 years, and this is about as exciting as reauthorization gets right here. So what is reauthorization? Every 4 years, Congress is to review and reauthorizes the section of the statutes, which is what Congress writes, that make up the National Pipeline Safety Act. That includes authorizing spending levels. So they set how much money they want to give PHMSA to do a variety of things. They review, implementation of previous congressional mandates, what they did the previous 4 or 8 or 12 years. Tweak the statutes if they want changes made. Sometimes that takes the form of asking for studies or reports, more so than changing the actual statutes. Then they do new directives to PHMSA if they've got things that they think that Congress needs to tell PHMSA to do. Who's normally involved with reauthorization? There's 3 main committees that deal with reauthorization. 2 in the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And sometimes in past reauthorizations, there's been a little argument about who has authority and who doesn't within those 2, but they both weigh in on PHMSA's reauthorization. And on the Senate, there's usually just 1 committee involved, and that's the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. They normally, going in front of Congress, or when Congress does things like this, it's not like going to your local city council where anybody can stand up and gets 3 minutes to talk, or where there's a way to provide information to the city council. It's like Congress asks for people to come talk to them. So normally the witnesses you see were kind of like that first picture I put up, or kind of like the 4 of us sitting here. It's the industry associations or designated executives from certain parts of the industry associations. PHMSA's usually invited there. They're usually on the hot seat more than the rest. State regulators, NTSB, GAO, the Governmental Accounting Office, Inspector General sometimes, and then often they try to have 1 slot for some kind of a public representative, and unfortunately that's often me, or fortunately, depending on the year and your point of view. Each committee usually produces their own bill. And then, in the House, they work out the differences between the 2 House versions. The House votes on a bill, the Senate votes on a bill, and if they're different, they form a conference committee to work out those differences. So I think we're each going to tell you where we think we're at today, since nothing has ultimately passed. The Senate committee passed a bill back in, I can't remember, June? July? Senate Bill 2299, Protecting Our Infrastructure of Pipelines Enhancing Safety Act of 2019. Sometimes they spend more time on the acronym of the act than they do on what's in the act. But hopefully my friends in the Senate don't hear me say this. Neither of the House committees has yet to pass a bill. The House Energy Committee did have a draft bill that they had scheduled for a markup where they were going to go forward with it, but they were trying to mark up, some ungodly number of bills in the same day, like 21 different bills or something, and this one fell off the calendar. Either they didn't have time or they didn't really want to deal with it. It was, at least for me, hard to tell why it didn't get moved forward, and it hasn't been rescheduled. The Democrats and the Republicans have started to kind of argue about who's being bipartisan and who's not, which has slowed the process down. And I'll get to the rumors of what I've heard, and we'll hear what the industry folks have heard too. There's a number of interesting things. Last time around 4 years ago, there was a general agreement, I think, amongst all the parties that we wanted a pretty straight reauthorization. Just give PHMSA the money and let them keep doing their work, because they had so many unfinished mandates because of the 2010 tragedies. They had all kinds of things they were supposed to be working on. They weren't done with yet. So there was general agreement from, I think, all the industry associations, certainly ourselves. Let's not try to pile more stuff on their plate, because they haven't got done what they were working on. This year it's been a little different. The end was in sight for some of the rules that Skip was talking about this morning that have been finalized, and so people kind of came into it with new ideas or old ideas that have been regurgitated again. And I'm just going to mention some of those. There's quite a bit of talk about changing the way civil and criminal penalty sections work. Either increasing PHMSA's ability to fine. Right now there's a cap on $2 million worth of fines, and people wanted to either remove that cap so that it'd be unlimited or just increase the amount they could fine for separate violations. There also has been some talk about making pipeline failures illegal. The public doesn't realize that spilling oil out onto the ground or having a pipeline rupture isn't illegal. It's a failure, but it isn't illegal. So there was some talk about changing that to make it very clear to companies that a pipeline failing was illegal. There's been quite a bit of talk about changing the criminal section. After San Bruno incident, the city of San Francisco tried to sue PHMSA for not doing their job. And it went to federal court, and the courts threw the case out because there's no mandamus is what it's called, and I'm going to talk about that in a section. There's no way for anybody to sue PHMSA for not doing their job. So there's some talk about changing the way criminal prosecutions could happen. There's also talk about making it easier to prosecute people who are protesting or harming pipelines. So it's kind of both sides, both looking at the industry and looking at people that, valve turners, if you will, that are protesting pipelines and potentially causing harm. A couple of the interesting things, we have been pushing the idea of getting rid of the cost benefit requirements under the statute. Right now, anytime PHMSA wants to look at a new regulation, they have to go through duplicative cost benefit. The OMB, the Office of Management and Budget at the White House, requires cost benefit. That's under an executive order, but there's also a cost benefit into the statute that Congress put there. So there's kind of two cost benefit analysis that has to go on. The one that's in the statute is different than the presidential executive order because it provides a legal option for the industry to potentially challenge or sue PHMSA if they don't think the cost benefit is justified. The executive order doesn't. It specifically says in the executive order you can't use the cost benefit to turn around and sue PHMSA. So we've said take the one out of the statute, leave the one at OMB, cost benefit makes sense. Everybody wants to know what the costs and the benefits are, but don't provide a legal opportunity for the industry to challenge things because that just slows down the regulatory process and draws things to a halt. And the people, some of the people in the room that are on some of the technical advisory committees know how, well, I don't know if anybody's ever been sued over that. It's certainly a veiled threat all the time when you're talking about these rules. Mandamus I talked about earlier, that's the ability to let a person go in and sue PHMSA if they're not doing their job. You can't sue them for anything. You can only sue them for things that Congress has told them to do that they're not doing. We think that's a good idea. We joined with the city of San Francisco when that lawsuit was going forward. Other interesting things, change in reporting requirements. There's a couple of different ones of those floating around. We've supported the ones of strengthening the reporting requirements for natural gas pipelines. Right now, like was said this morning, you can release 3 million cubic feet of gas before you have to report. We think that should be a lower number that aligns it better with what the hazardous liquid side does and starts to account for methane better. So we think that's a strengthening. On the weakening side, there's been a push for changing the property damage threshold from $50,000. If you do $50,000 of damage, you have to report. People want to raise that up to $100,000 or more, which would change the number of reports coming in. Let's see, what else did I find interesting? Gathering lines that were mentioned a couple times this morning, 435,000 miles of totally unregulated gathering lines. And there's some members of Congress who have a bee in their bonnet about that and have been trying through some of these bills to start doing that because they haven't seen enough movement from PHMSA's side. I think the bill that passed the Senate, boy, July was a long time ago, included a clause to take a look at gathering lines, and it wasn't much more than gather some information about what gathering lines are, and then I think there was some language in there to require PHMSA to pass some kind of regulations within some kind of a timeline. I already mentioned the idea of making unintended releases illegal, which people find surprising that that's not already illegal. Lots of talk about automated shutoff valves and leak detection, which has been talked about depending on which side of the industry you're looking at. 20 or 30 years now, and it still isn't on the books. PHMSA is working on some of those rules right now, and we're supposed to see those. I haven't seen them yet, so I don't know how well they are. And then there's some of the, in the Senate bill, there was some inclusion of some stuff that came out of the Merrimack Valley. Some kind of more clarity on distribution integrity management and operation manuals and emergency response for distribution pipelines. And I think, and Christina can probably talk about this, I think the distribution industry has helped work on that stuff a lot. So here's my last slide of unconfirmed rumors of what's going to happen next. What we've heard, and we are mainly talking to the Democratic side of things, is that the two House committees, the chairmen of those two committees are working together on a joint bill. So instead of each coming up with separate bills, we may see two bills from those committees that are pretty darn similar. We're expecting to see those soon, like in the next month. There was talk of having a markup and hopefully getting those passed through those committees at least by the end of the year, with hopes of then finalizing it in the House and moving it on to the Senate soon after, like by the end of June. Yeah, June. That might be more reality based, by the end of January. So that's the best we've heard. You know, there's also rumors that some people in Congress are going to put a hold on this type of stuff. There's some rumors that people don't care if it gets reauthorized at all because PHMSA keeps getting money, so what does it matter? They just want to wait for a new president. Hopefully we aren't going to wait that long, because even the Senate bill included some really good stuff, and I think that one's ready to move. That's all I had. And John, you up next? We'll do questions at the end, unless I already covered everything. Let's see. Must be why this mouse is here, because the thing doesn't work. There you go. John Stoody with the Association of Oil Pipelines.
Thanks, Carl. And I'll give you both my perspective on the issues and then also the process as well. And we can answer any questions. Carl mentioned I'm with the Association of Oil Pipelines, been there about 7 years. I lead government and public relations. Before coming to AOPL, I worked in the Senate for 12 years in the Environment Committee. So had experience working on bills like this. And then before the Senate at the Environmental Protection Agency for 7 years. So this outlines our prime policy priorities for the process. And I guess to back up, you were talking and it spurred my thought, you know, we've been getting the question lately, like, do we even need to do a reauthorization? And for the last 10, 20 years, Congress has been doing it out of habit. Every 4 years they would do it. And as Carl mentioned, they don't have to do it. You've heard and talk and seen on the news when there's an occasional shutdown, government shutdown, when Congress doesn't approve funding. That's not the scenario for PHMSA. PHMSA will continue to percolate along as is, as long as they're funded like the rest of the government, like Congress. So it is a good question, why do we need reauthorization? And we heard a little bit about that this morning after Bellingham. If there's something that happens and it's a big enough problem, then it will spur Congress into action. And I think we'd all agree the Integrity Management Program and certainly the 811 programs and worker OQ are positive things that came out of Congress acting. And indeed, after Marshall, Michigan, 2010, the reauthorization a few years after that included things like on automated valves and better control room management and the like. So Congress will take the opportunity to use this process to make improvements if they see there's a problem. So that's reason number one. If there's a big incident and says, oh, we need to do something about this area. And then other times there can be just plain good reasons. For example, Carl and Administrator Elliott mentioned PHMSA passing rulemakings. Congress in past reauthorizations has asked PHMSA or told PHMSA to do rulemakings on various subjects. And the last administration didn't do those. They were delayed. And now this administration, Skip Elliott, has gotten most of those mandates done. But that's been a question they've asked Carl, they've asked all the witnesses. Why did it take PHMSA so long to pass some of these, or to institute some of these regulations? And some of them have been on tough engineering problems, like Marshall, Michigan, if you recall that, it was about cracking in pipe. Stress corrosion cracking, if you have maybe one little crack won't make the pipe burst, but if you have a lot of little cracks in one area, and then you're stressing that through pumping, it can lead to an incident, right? That's the story of Marshall. But there's nothing in current PHMSA regulations about that. You won't see any of that in PHMSA regulations. So, but the answer is, well, when do you repair that? How many little cracks? How close should they be? How much pressure by pumping? Those are all kind of engineering questions that would need to be asked. PHMSA didn't have ready answers for those, and there's been delays. And we'll talk about some of the proposals we had to help PHMSA get the information it needs to regulate pipelines. So here's the three main areas. Carl made reference to protect public safety. One issue that worried us was something that was similar to what happened in Bellingham in terms of root cause, and that's a pressure surge, a malfunctioning valve. Obviously there were lots of reasons for that, but the valve turning itself, not protesting, not expressing your opinion, but actually going onto the facility and potentially manipulating the facility in a way that would cause an accident, either an explosion or the environment. We wanted to avoid that. There's also been shootings and blowtorchings of pipe components. So we did have a proposal for those physical types of activities that would threaten safety itself, not the extra. There's been bills in terms of protesting. We weren't for those. It was just about the pipe itself. Harnessing technology and innovation, just made reference to that. How do we help PHMSA get the technical information it needs to impose new regulations on industry? This might be ironic, but we would actually like more regulation in some of these areas. And you may say that doesn't make sense. But there are gaps in PHMSA regulations that aren't dealing with things like cracks. 20 years it's been since they've updated some of these technical areas of their regulations. That also means that we're not able to take advantage of new technologies, new smart pigs, because the regulations can get in the way of that. So we actually want to modernize regulations. We want to have regulations solve that kind of some of these problems, and had proposals for that. And then improving PHMSA programs and regulations. Some of this was made reference to before. PHMSA is small. They could use more people, or maybe they have people and they have a hard time keeping them on staff, retaining them through salary or otherwise. So we had ideas on that. I won't go through each of these, but I put this up more. I mean, these are our specific provisions that we were advocating for. Just to give you an example of, here were the ideas that we brought to the table that would help address some of these, like the pilot testing of technologies. Say there is a new smart pig, or maybe there is a new best practice to look at cracking. Let's have a way for PHMSA in a controlled environment, like a pilot test, to have a few operators try that out temporarily, not forever, just for a unique set in time, get the data, and that could help them write a new regulation to take advantage of those technologies. Encourage joint stakeholder problem solving, the trust. Some of you in this room were involved in the voluntary information sharing effort. That was actually an Obama administration proposal to have stakeholders from the environmental groups, from safety groups, from labor unions, from industry, from regulators come together and share information, set up a framework for that. That's something we support, we participate in. We provided language for Congress to hopefully adopt. And then you see here that help PHMSA hire and retain pipeline inspectors. I'm happy to answer questions on any of these, but I'll just go ahead. So Carl made made reference to, things have pretty much ground to a halt in Washington, D.C. on pipeline safety, as well as everything you read in the news. It's all true, and it has impacts. When everyone's grumpy and angry at each other, it hurts working together on things like pipeline safety or highways or pensions or whatever else. Now, we did have an example of a success, which was the Senate bill. The Senate came together, Democrats and Republicans, in a bipartisan bill, and it passed out of the Senate Commerce Committee. And Christina's actually going to describe some of the provisions that would increase regulation, increase requirements on industry to deal with the Merrimack disaster that you heard about this morning. So there are actually bipartisan provisions Republicans and Democrats agreed to, she's going to talk about, that are possible. But that's being held up in the House because the House hasn't moved forward. It's more of a partisan atmosphere. The Democrats and Republicans haven't been able to come together. And even if things do move forward, maybe within a couple of weeks for a markup, or if it's before Thanksgiving or maybe into the new year, that still wouldn't result in legislating, because if it's a one-sided bill, that's not going to be enough to get through a Republican Senate, right? You have to work together, House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans. So bipartisan legislating, something we need. A focus on safety. Some of the issues that have come into the current year are outside of traditional pipeline safety issues. Carl put up a lot of those in terms of enforcement, civil action regulating, all within the pipeline safety and the jurisdiction of DOT. There are issues that are very important policy issues on methane, climate change, that need to be debated, but traditionally those were outside of pipeline safety, and if pipeline safety is going to be a vehicle for working on those, it's going to stop the process, because those are, obviously climate change is a big policy debate going on across the nation, right? And Congress hasn't been able to do much about it. And if we bring those fights down into our little pipeline safety bill, it's going to stop forward progress on pipeline safety. And then working together, made reference to the voluntary information sharing work group. That was kicked off by the last reauthorization, as I described, to bring stakeholders together to see if we, like the airlines, we sit together in a room and we talk about a safety problem, and we bring the perspectives of public expertise, of the labor unions, of industry, of technology vendors. Perhaps we can advance these additional levels of safety, these more complex problems we heard about, some of the things that are less predictable, because we have perspectives of, even in this room, is similarly reflecting. We have proposals for that. They're not doing so well in the current markup, but if we had more folks both advocating together and substantive programs where we work together, that would be positive. Happy to answer questions at the end.
Thanks, John.
Christina Sames is up from Association of American Gas Association. And as soon as I find the magic here. It'll be real interesting at the end to have some questions and talk about the devil in the details.
I was talking about me, but I'm trying to say work together.
So I'm going to dive into the details, and I'm going to cover, in the Senate, the bill that passed, about half of the bill was in direct response to Merrimack Valley. I'll give you the punchline. Everything I'm going to show you has the support of industry, at least the distribution industry, okay? And I'm going to try to follow what Carl says is a 10-minute presentation. We'll see. I wanted to show this slide because it provides a quick overview of where we're seeing different elements. And I apologize, the industry talks in acronyms. So automatic shut-off valves, remote control valves, or the ASVs, RCVs. Overpressure protection, DIMP, distribution integrity management, distribution records, pipeline safety management systems, national pipeline mapping system, etc. I'm going to talk about the provisions that are in the yellow boxes. And I'm going to start with Maybe, if it works. There you go. Yeah, I was trying. It didn't seem to want to click the first time. Overpressurization. So Merrimack Valley was, and you heard about it this morning, the sensor line when they were replacing the cast iron pipe with newer pipe. They didn't take into account the sensing lines. And what that then did was there's things called worker monitor regulators. When the regulator senses no pressure or drop in pressure, it begins to open up. It did what it was supposed to do. It opened up, more gas flowed through, and all the pilot lights that were in the homes became torches. So overpressurization is something that, and you heard the NTSB comment on the document that the AGA pulled together in record time. That included input from just about every AGA member company. We have about 95% of the gas that's delivered to homes and businesses, so a lot of people. We actually pulled together into a workshop over 200 individuals to help us figure out everything and anything we could possibly think of to prevent overpressurization. It's in that document. It's on the AGA website if you'd like to look at it. Anyways, so getting back to the Senate bill. If you see E and C at the top of my slide, that means Energy and Commerce. It's a provision within the Energy and Commerce bill, the last bill that we saw, and it's also in the Senate bill. So I tried to give you a little bit of where these are coming from. So first, require backup protection capable of shutting off gas, relieving gas, or controlling the release of gas. You have operation and maintenance plans to include procedures for overpressurization and management of change. Management of change is one of the elements, a portion of pipeline safety management systems. It's getting pulled into this. They were real specific. They're currently specific on where management of change should apply when it comes to overpressurization. So significant technology, equipment, procedural, organizational changes all require a qualified personnel to review and certify that the construction plans are accurate, complete, and correct. Because overpressurization is such a big component of the bills, I needed 2 slides. I couldn't cover it in one, and I wanted to give you some more on the specific of what's in the Senate bill. So within 1 year, PHMSA to require distribution operators assess and upgrade, as appropriate, each district regulator station to minimize the risk of pressure exceedance caused by a common mode of failure. Regulators must have secondary backup pressure relieving devices or other overpressurization technology. Regulators and monitor configuration, the configuration that was in Merrimack Valley, must eliminate a common mode of failure or shut off the gas. And qualified personnel to monitor pressures of low-pressure distribution systems during construction. Moving on to DIMP, they want to make sure that operators are evaluating the risk of cast iron, CI, and low-pressure systems. Energy and Commerce, so this is, I kind of thought this was funny. When we're talking to the Senate, we're like, well, you should throw in Bear Steel also. They're like, no, that wasn't Merrimack Valley. I'm like, yeah, but you should still throw it in because we're doing it anyways. So Energy and Commerce, they're including Bear Steel. Consider factors other than past abnormal operating conditions, AOCs. Avoid a risk ranking of 0, unless that's supported by engineering analysis or operational knowledge. So for example, you can't say that there's no threat of atmospheric corrosion unless you have the data that proves you have no atmospheric corrosion. PHMSA to audit states to ensure sufficient review of both the DIMP plans, emergency response plans, operation and maintenance manuals, and ensure sufficient inspectors. And PHMSA or the state to review all of those plans at least every 5 years and to record the results. For distribution records, it follows the path of what we already have on the transmission side. Identify and manage traceable, reliable, and complete records that are critical to ensure proper pressure control. Energy and Commerce adds up to date to that provision. Records are to be accessible to all personnel responsible for performing or overseeing. In the Senate, they say relevant construction or engineering work. Energy and Commerce says any activity that has the potential to cause a hazardous overpressurization. On the Senate side, other records needed for risk analysis to be collected opportunistically, and those records are to be submitted or made available to PHMSA and the state. For operator qualification, also something within both the Energy and Commerce and the Senate, require qualified individuals to monitor gas pressure and have capability to promptly shut down the flow of gas or otherwise prevent control over pressurization. For the Senate, they're specific on during construction, and then Energy and Commerce during any activity. And they have a provision of where it doesn't apply. For emergency response plans, quickly establish communications with first responders, public officials, and the public when there's an unintended release of gas that results in one of those four items: fire, explosion, fatality, or shutdown of gas to a significant number of customers. Senate doesn't define significant number of customers. Energy and Commerce was looking at 100. And then develop voluntary opt-in system to allow rapid communication to customers. Some additional provisions on the Senate side: encourages self-disclosure, which is also part of safety management systems. Open sharing of information, so self-disclosure and correction of violations or actions to correct a violation prior to discovery. This is very similar to what the airline industry does for safety management systems. And then there's provisions on pipeline safety management systems, a report on the number of distribution operators they're actually implementing. Side note, AGA does something called peer reviews, which is gas companies reviewing gas companies to figure out what they're doing well and where they have opportunities to improve. I can tell you that every company, I just did another review last week, every company that I'm reviewing is already on this path. I've yet to find one that's not. If they weren't, I'm pretty darn sure that'd be in their final report. Anyways, and then states and PHMSA to actually encourage adoption, promotion and assessment of SMS frameworks, and encourage self-disclosure. And then this is my last slide. Additional provisions within the House Energy and Commerce. There's provisions on community right to know. So reviewing existing public education programs, so the use of one call, for example, hazards associated with an unintended release, physical indications of a release, to submit a description of the program plus any changes that have been made, create a liaison, if not already in existence, with state and local emergency responders, and then PHMSA to conduct an evaluation to determine if those emergency responders actually have sufficient information. And if not, what else do they need? What's missing? For this particular one, we pushed hard for there to be outreach directly to, like, the fire marshals, National Association of Fire Marshals, fire chiefs, the emergency response community, to figure out what exactly do you want from us? Because there's a lot that we already provide, and what I keep hearing is keep it simple. If you give us a big, thick manual, we're not going to use it. So what we really want to know is what exactly do you need if we're not getting it to you already. And with that, I know we'll take questions at the end.
Thanks, Christina. And last up is Jim Gordon, who I can't read and I can't do two things at once, is what I'm trying to say. We have some advisory committee members in the room. And last but not least is Jim Gordon, who's the manager of federal government relations and policy for TC Energy. You're good to go.
Very good. Well, thank you, Carl, and thank you, everyone, for taking time to be in this forum today. I'm excited to participate in this very important discussion about pipeline safety reauthorization. I've been with TC Energy for a little more than 2.5 years, and just on background slightly on the company, we were formerly TransCanada. As of May 3rd, we changed from TransCanada to TC Energy because it better reflects who the company is as a whole. We're a North American energy infrastructure company, not just Canadian, not just pipelines, so the name change better reflects who the company is. I came to TC Energy straight from the Hill, straight from Capitol Hill, and with some local government experience prior to that. So I've worked with communities concerned about pipelines coming through their neighborhoods, coming through their backyards, and the safety of those pipelines. And I've worked on legislation to improve pipeline safety. I worked in the district for my former boss, and I worked for the city council prior to that, and then I also worked in his legislative office, so I've worked on legislation on pipeline safety, reauthorization as well. So I think I bring an important perspective to industry and to the reauthorization effort. I'm probably going to say a lot of what's already been said, unfortunately. As I mentioned, TC Energy, North American energy company. You can see we're in Canada, United States, and Mexico. We've got more than 3,000 employees in the United States and working in 40 states. More than 31,000 miles or about 31,000 miles of natural gas pipelines across the United States, 1,900 liquid miles in the United States. And industry itself, with regard to natural gas, has about 300,000 miles of pipelines in the United States. And on any given day, TC Energy is moving about 25% of all the gas molecules that move around North America. So we're everywhere. Transmission pipelines safely, reliably, and efficiently bring the resource from its source to where it's needed. And I simply cannot overstate how important safety is to TC Energy and to the industry as a whole. We've embraced the use of technology to more completely and efficiently understand and manage the safety and integrity of our systems. And in fact, TC Energy spent about $1.8 billion on integrity and maintenance programs in 2018. We engage with communities and first responders to educate, train for a potential, though unlikely, emergency situation. And TC Energy has partnered with the International Association of Fire Chiefs since 2013 in this effort, working with them to reach out to communities and work on local responses to potential incidents. During this particular reauthorization process, I personally have participated in joint meetings with members representing the IAFC, the International Association of Fire Chiefs, on Capitol Hill to talk about the importance of moving forward some of these pipeline safety authorization provisions. I'll say again that safety and integrity of our pipelines is primary is of primary importance to TC Energy and to industry. Before the reauthorization really got rolling, industry established priorities by which to advance pipeline safety and integrity. First and foremost was finishing the outstanding rules, which have been referenced on a number of occasions here this afternoon. These are rules that were reviewed and supported by the Gas Pipeline Advisory Committee, and which promote the use of innovative technology. Those rules were broadly supported. We had a joint stakeholder letter with the Pipeline Safety Trust, Pipeline Safety Coalition, and industry that went to Department of Transportation Secretary Chow, asking that she expedite the finalizing of these rules, and also to underscore the broad support that these rules had. The four leaders on the Senate Commerce Committee, the two subcommittee chairs and chairs and ranking member, and the two full committee chairs and ranking member, Democrats and Republicans, all four signed a letter also to Secretary Chow asking that she expedite the finalization of these rules. And there's really no actual legislative action needed on these rules, but we understood that moving these rules would really help to launch us into the next generation of innovative technology to manage and modernize and manage and review our systems throughout the country. And another important aspect of what we were focusing on was strengthening PHMSA in its rulemaking process. As Carl mentioned, these hearings on Capitol Hill, sometimes they're a little droll, sometimes they can drag on a bit, but Skip Elliott mentioned earlier, he was at a hearing about 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago, and he just got his ears boxed, really, from both sides of the aisle, just for how long it had taken for the rules to progress and to be finalized. And to his credit, as he mentioned earlier, he's moved quite quickly, well, quickly in relative terms. This is Washington D.C. after all. But he's moved ahead with those, and he's done a good job. But we think it's important that the agency itself is reinforced with the appropriate manpower and reinforced with the appropriate funding levels to continue to move ahead with these rulemakings. It's important to us that we have it's important to all of us that we have a strong regulator and predictable regulations. Industry's been engaged in a bipartisan and bicameral reauthorization advocacy effort since January of 2019. I can say personally for me, I've been working on this since December of last year, so almost a year. I had an existing relationship with the staff or the incoming chairman of the subcommittee on pipelines on the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee, and they called me last December and they said, you know, our guy's going to be the chairman. Would you mind coming in and kind of getting us up to speed on the pipeline side of what the committee is going to do? So I was happy to come in, and I started that, and I see Andy Drake back there, Andy Drake from Enbridge and Sonia Kirby from TC Energy came to Capitol Hill in January, and we went to the various offices on both sides of the Capitol and talked to them about the transmission rules, talking about the importance of the use of new technology and integrity management. And it was a great couple of meetings that we had back in January to really educate staff on the importance of where industry is going on integrity management. It was actually interesting. We were sitting there talking with one of the staffers and explaining the importance of heaping these rules on us, and he kind of sat back and scratched his head and said, you know, it's not that often that industry comes in and says, you know, we support being regulated. It's kind of contrary to what you hear up there on Capitol Hill. So it was a good indication that we all were going to be moving forward in the next coming months. So just briefly on the state of play, as has been discussed, the reauthorization bill has traditionally been a fairly bipartisan effort. In the Senate, it usually passes under what you call unanimous consent. It doesn't come to the floor. Everybody essentially has agreed that they agree on this, and it moves along. In the House, it comes up under what you call suspension of the rules, which is reserved for non-controversial bills, and you have to get 70% of voting members on the floor. Normally, you just need simple majority, but for a suspension bill, it's supposed to be non-controversial. You got to get 70% of the voting members on the floor to support the bill. 2/3, 67.7. But usually that's how pipeline safety authorization passed in the House as well. And you'd have votes of 412 to 2 and things like that. So typically this was something that moved along quite easily through Congress. I think it's safe to say, we all probably realize, things have changed in government and politics over the last, I'll say 12 years or so, but more so recently, and it changes more quickly. And people are just, politics permeates everything now, and it's kind of unfortunate because there's important stuff that needs to get done that hasn't been at this point. But industry, let me just take a step back on the bipartisan nature. As was referenced earlier, the Senate bill really maintains that trend. I mean, they did, as a committee, they worked together up until the last minute. I mean, CJ and I and a few others are standing in line waiting for the Senate Commerce hearing markup on their pipeline safety authorization bill. And this is not exaggeration. We're standing in the line waiting to go to the hearing, and CJ got an email from one of the staffers saying, we have a deal. So, I mean, it was up until the last minute that they were working on trying to move something forward. And it was truly a bipartisan effort in the Senate side. And by the structure of the two houses and how things work, I mean, you have to be able to get something through the Senate. If you're not going to get 60 votes on the Senate side, you're not going to be able to move things. There's still room for compromise, but that's kind of the gold standard, is something that gets 60 in the Senate. But industry continues. We continue to engage both parties and encourage them to return to the table to a bipartisan effort. But the Senate version, as mentioned earlier, I'm still on this page, is not it's not really a transmission-centric bill. As Christina mentioned, there's a lot on distribution in there. but there's some important things that we've seen in there as well. The PHMSA Pipeline Safety Program, as John mentioned, and I think we heard from Steve Ernst earlier today, talking about the advancements in this technology and what's on the horizon for smart pigs, for example. And if we don't have the ability to quickly adapt to new technology, we're going to miss some serious opportunities at improving our systems. So I think a lot of what we heard today kind of ties together there. And another important piece was the increase in authorization levels, because that's funded by pipeline user fees, and every reauthorization we expect to be paying a little bit more. But these funds, this increase in funds will support improvements of PHMSA workforce, staffing numbers, hiring, retention, and provide revenue to enhance state pipeline safety workforce, which is critical, which is very critical. And as mentioned earlier, the House Energy and Commerce Committee, they took a run at their bill earlier this year. They went as far as they could with it, came close to bringing it into a markup, and the two sides couldn't agree, so they tabled it in June or July. The House Transportation Infrastructure Committee was very close, working with all of us, but in my context with CJ and committee staff, they were getting very close to having a product they could show their chairman, and then their chairman came back after August recess and said, pull it back, we need to do a few more things here. So it's been reported that the House committees are working on something that could potentially come to committee before Thanksgiving, potentially, because they have markups scheduled the 19th and the 20th in various committees. But the indication is that it's going to be a partisan effort, and more of a messaging piece. And I'm not pointing fingers at any side, but that's the indication, is that it's going to be a messaging piece for one of the parties, and it's going to just probably have no chance at moving beyond a markup in getting to the floor. Because if you move something to the floor like this, it could really just open up divisions within the majority party, for example, if there's a debate on the larger issues, as John pointed out, on the floor of the House of Representatives over what should essentially be a bill that everybody agrees on to improve the integrity and the safety of our systems. I mean, everybody needs the energy we're moving, and we need to move it as safely and efficiently as possible. And we should all agree on that, and we have in the past. And so the path forward, we really need to consider the bipartisan Senate bill as a standard. We as industry strongly support reauthorization. John mentioned that, Christina mentioned that. If anybody hears people say that it doesn't need to be reauthorized because the funds keep coming in, that's bunk, to be quite honest with you. We're really focused on trying to move this forward and improving the situation for all of us. There's a lot of things, if it was left to just continually just fund without moving anything forward, a lot of good things that would wither on the vine that have been talked about today. Increased appropriation for PHMSA, improvement to the workforce at PHMSA, increases of state grant funding for emergency response grants. We just had the folks from Kentucky in there talking about understanding the systems and our folks going out to and talking to local first responders about how to handle these types of situations. I mean, we're looking at opportunities to improve that situation that would really just lie dormant if we don't address this in this coming stretch. There's some LNG regulations that need to be improved. So I think we're there. I mean, stakeholders and most policymakers feel that the sides agree on more than they disagree on. And if they get back to the table, they would be able to work through the differences. And I firmly believe that to be the case too. I think some people have to let certain things run their course, and hopefully people will pivot back to the bipartisan effort before not too long. But I think I can speak for us all when I say, we're hopeful that an agreement will happen before too long. So thank you for your time, and I appreciate your opportunity to ask some questions a little bit later.
All right, we have, according to my agenda, plenty of time for questions. So, Chuck, full disclosure, Chuck testified to which House was House Energy this summer.
So on I guess this is to John and maybe Christina too. The provision that's proposed in the Senate bill about further criminalizing vandalism that endangers public safety, I don't think very many people would disagree that endangering public safety, whether it's you think you're protesting or whatever by turning a valve or damaging a pipeline, an active pipeline, is not a good thing. But what we're seeing in the states, and what I'm concerned may get hijacked in Congress, because what we're seeing in the states is criminalizing legitimate protest. And it's been made a felony in Texas. I think some of it's going to get thrown out on constitutional grounds, I would hope. But it would be good if the associations would come out with something in writing that says we disagree with that approach. Because it's happened, it's being pushed in almost every state in the country. And I think because of that, I suspect that if that provision goes forward in the Senate bill, that it will get hijacked and rewritten. And what are y'all's thoughts on that?
Well, thanks, and we do, and one of the sad things is we tried to craft this narrowly. So the written statement was the bill itself. And we were aware of the state provisions, Oklahoma and others. And there were both substantive and strategic reasons not to do that. One is a lot of the state law, you may know, is on trespass. And that can get into a lot of the protesting stuff, right? And we wanted to just totally stay away from anything related to protesting. We were aware of the politics of it, the expression, but then also the legality. And really our core interest was just the facilities itself. What's happening outside the fence, or blocking entrances, or slowing construction. We get it. We don't like it, but we understand it. So we specifically did not write the bill to follow those state ones, and so we don't use trespass. We can't really, even in the federal context. And there are existing provisions in the pipeline code about damaging or destroying interstate pipelines, but those don't apply to pipes under construction or things that don't damage, like valve turning. So we tried to be very specific. We actually, during Senate negotiations, tried to tighten it further, and we think in the House we have an even tighter, really honing in on how do we keep the pipe safe. All the other expression of opinion is outside the scope of this. So that's where we are. We have opponents that continue to mischaracterize it as a protest bill. We understand why they would want to do it. It's in their strategic interest to mischaracterize it to their advantage. So, it's life in the jungle. But what we actually proposed and what we're actually trying to do is very different and much narrower than that.
If I could chime on that a little bit, I think there's been a little bit of confusion over what's actually been introduced in the various places. The one thing that I don't think any of us mentioned was, while each committee can kind of come up with their own bill, the administration comes up with a bill too, and they floated that fairly early. And there was some less than clear language about protest in the administration bill that got a lot of people's concerns up. And so I think I think the industry was as surprised with some of that language as others were, and that language hasn't gone anywhere in any of the committees that I know of.
And that's exactly what I was going to say. As when it was originally proposed, you could interpret it that peaceful protests would be included. And that's why John said we actually worked to get it extremely narrow, to only focus on things that would result in a pipeline safety issue. But it's not in the current Senate bill, and I haven't seen anything on the House side, so we'll see what happens.
Other questions? Oh, come on.
I'm Bob Ratcliffe from Tallahassee, where I was a county commissioner for 12 years from 1998 to 2010. And except for the alarming number of ungrateful voters, I would still be a county commissioner.
That's the spirit.
One of my frustrations was that we had the Florida Gas Transmission Company, which came through Leon County on its way to Central and South Florida. It is the major supplier of natural gas to the state of Florida. There was an original line, and then there were two new lines that were in a different location south of the downtown Tallahassee. But the original line, 24 inches, very high pressure, is in an area that's been developing rapidly with residential and commercial development. So one of the things that I accomplished as a county commissioner was getting into our GIS system an accurate map of the pipelines. Not just, there's this line on a piece of paper, but something that was in our GIS system that was accurate up to a foot. And our goal was to have this as an overlay on our GIS maps that would allow developers to know if they bought a piece of property, if there was a pipeline there and where it was. Well, we couldn't get accurate information from OPS or from Florida Gas, so we were reduced to walking the lines. And in fact, what we found was that it was really way off from what we were furnished. But then we get to the problem of setbacks. How close can a house be to a pipeline, particularly a high pressure line? I tried it out once with a developer who was in a real jam and needed our approval, and I talked him into a 75-foot setback. Well, that's the nearest house, in other words, could be within 75 feet of the pipeline, which is really inadequate for a line like that. It is a growing public safety issue that development is taking place on or next to pipeline rights-of-ways. And I don't know what the solution is, but I think in this next, after this passes, that should be a serious consideration. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go on this one. So I know, Carl, I believe you were involved in, and I think it's on your website, the PIPA document, which is a great document for developers that are trying to build along an existing transmission or liquid line. And it provides different avenues and considerations. So first, if you're not aware of that document, I know it's on your website, it's on PHMSA's website. I think they've been trying to update it. Second, I hope that the audience knows that there's now the National Pipeline Mapping System, which shows the location of the liquid lines and the transmission lines. There was a big effort in a proposal late spring, early summer, to update that, which I know the industry, I don't speak for the transmission industry, but we also happen to have operators with transmission lines. We were all supportive of it, updating it. I don't know when that will go into effect. We're still waiting, but the data that's currently there will be even better with this revision.
I'd say briefly on reauthorization, that is a casualty of the current standoff, which is we've worked, Christina and I personally have worked on provisions, language that we've given to the House on using PHMSA's National Pipeline Mapping System, expanding it, getting more information out to the public, both on the route of the pipeline and some of its integrity issues, what type of product, when was it inspected, those kind of things. So that language is out there ready to be taken up. Unfortunately, things are at a standstill with where things are with the political climate. But there is that opportunity to do more of what you're talking about through federal legislation.
Yeah, and I can just chime in a little bit on that same question. Bob and I have talked about this, and there is a lot of good documentation in PIPE, and local governments do have the ability to create setbacks to some degree. I'm also a recovering elected official. I was in office for 12 years, and my voters never threw me out. I just threw them out. But while I introduced pipeline safety bill, that we created a 500-foot setback from the transmission pipelines in our community, but only for hard to evacuate things, hospitals, jails, nursing homes. You can't in our county build one of those within 500 feet of a transmission pipeline. And no one, the industry thought that was great, and none of the developers had a problem with it either.
Well, thanks, Carl. That's an amazing setup from my comment, which is, yes, you can create that kind of rules in your town that you can't build next to existing pipelines, and that's all about what developers can't do. But unfortunately, there are no such rules that pipeline companies and pipeline developers can't do that in your community and can't come within 50 feet of your house or hospital or daycare center, and they do propose this. So I would like to see, and I think this speaks to the larger issue that PHMSA is only on the scene when after a pipeline is operational. And there are many of us who feel that PHMSA should be involved sooner in the proposal process, and that siting has a very big safety consideration attached to it. So I think you have to look at this through both sides of the lens.
Yeah, the other important thing that I would add to your point is that, in Texas, our state legislature has been taking away the ability of municipalities to institute ordinances. There's this whole local preemption thing. So, the ability of local governments to do something about this is really, really limited compared to, federal agencies like PHMSA.
Got about
Thank you
5
all.
minutes more.
First of all, I want to apologize for stepping in late, and I missed some of you, and I'm sorry about that. I was at the non-regulatory piece. And I guess I have a bigger question about how to get past gridlock and what it looks like for public safety advocates, those of us like Carl and myself and others in this room who work in the public interest side of pipeline safety, how we and the industry work together to get past this gridlock. Because I believe there are common elements that we all want to do together. And I also realize that there are political ideologies taking advantage of the differences in the public sphere to separate that. So I think, we're more powerful together. So I'm just posing this question to all of you. What do we do? How do we work more together and have a common face on these issues when it comes to the legislators? Thank you.
I think you have to make your voice heard, right? And so, it's been referenced, industry is going to be up there. That we get paid, that's my job. And as you've heard, we actually would like reauthorization, and we'd like an updating of PHMSA regulations. And we saw that it can work in the Senate. There was bipartisan. But we also have in the House, there's a conflict between pipeline safety, which could move forward, but then also other issues traditionally non-pipeline safety. And unfortunately for the system, those are fights on the other side, the environmental side versus the pipeline safety side. And that's really what it's about. Methane, what to do about methane emissions, to what extent that impacts climate change, what's the role of EPA, all excellent policy debates, but that's preventing pipeline safety. So people aren't going to, obviously the environmental debate is very loud. And unless the pipeline safety debate becomes just as loud, they'll trample our little work over here. And, that's obviously it puts a lot of safety advocates in a tough position, because then you can say, hey, environmental group, lay off so we can get our little pipeline safety bill through. That's obviously a tough ask, but that is the current situation, that things are waiting and stalled because of the desire to use the pipeline safety bill to address some of these broader issues.
I think the other thing that you have to remember is that we do agree on a lot of things and move a lot of things forward. Everything that Christina was talking about on the distribution side that was passed in that, the Democrats in the Senate called us up after Christina went in and visited with them. They want to do all this stuff. What do you think? All good ideas. Go for it. Voluntary information sharing, something that's close to you. We've supported that all along. So there's a lot of things that we can support. There's areas that, like getting rid of the cost benefit or mandamus that we probably won't. The other thing that goes on with these bills is some of the committees throw in what they know are giveaways. So we end up fighting over things that the committees don't think they're going to get anyway, just because they think if they have some giveaways and the other people have some giveaways, we'll end up in the middle. And we waste a lot of time on those things sometimes.
I would just echo that specifically too, Carl, because in some instances we don't know really when we're talking to committee staff, for example, we may not necessarily know 100% what their priorities are. And so we do waste a lot of valuable time. And I'm candid to a fault, unfortunately, and my wife tells me that all the time. But there's, as I mentioned earlier, I don't know if you came in for this, but I've been in meetings with the International Association of Fire Chiefs to talk about the importance of their piece of this. And truly, more staffers understand, and more people are in agreement on more things than they are in disagreement. So we need to, as like a coalition. And as John said, people sometimes view industry as just being the bad guy, and it's absolutely not true in this particular instance. I mean, are we angels? Most likely not. But at the end of the day, there's going to be things in a final bill that we don't like, and there's going to be things in the end of the day that in there that we like, and things that the environmentalists don't like, or things that Carl aren't necessarily is going to agree with. But that's how this should work. And to the methane piece, and that is my understanding is what has kind of slowed things down in the House. And some of us would argue that there's room to work there too. But until, I think, right now, in this point in time, until people get to kind of, run out their piece of this and get feedback large and loud, they're going to continue to try to, message what they think they need to message in order to protect themselves at home or wherever it may be. So politics has permeated everything.
Could you explain what the methane piece is that came around this time?
I'll start. I mean, our systems release methane into the atmosphere, and natural gas systems release methane into the atmosphere in certain situations. And we are working, as we have been for years now, to capture as much methane as we can when we're working through our regular course of action, and if we're upgrading systems or blowing down systems, whatever we may need to do, replacing segments of pipeline. And there's instances of flaring. So there is some, and we are making progress. Because of the focus now on the larger debate on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions and such, people think we're not doing it fast enough. People think we should do more. And that's a debate certainly worth having, but this is a pipeline safety bill, and PHMSA is a pipeline safety administration. And if you're going to start giving them also more responsibility, like on the environmental side of things, it starts to get a little far. Their mandates start to get kind of out of whack, if you will. And so no one disagrees that we should talk about what more we can do, but for the purpose of pipeline safety, let's keep it within the jurisdiction of the safety and integrity of pipelines.
And I'll just echo what Environmental Defense always says at advisory committee meetings when people say that, is PHMSA's authority isn't just for public safety, it's for public safety and the environment. And the environment often gets forgotten.
I'd just add briefly, another part of it is frustration by some over the Trump administration's environmental EPA and their proposal to reverse methane regulation for upstream production. So that's a very valid thing to discuss as well, but that's a whole separate agency, EPA, Clean Air Act. That's creating a lot of trouble about, do you do something with DOT and the Transportation Code to address this EPA Clean Air Act issue, and it's really gummed up the system.
I don't recall seeing any language in the 2019 Pipes Act about methane, and so
I think I heard, Carl, your alarm going off.
Yeah, we're out of time.
However, but what I want,
But I can tell you what was in that
But-
act.
no, but what I was going to say is, I'm actually been carrying around for months the different provisions, so I have it, if you want to come up and look at it afterwards.
Yeah, there were a couple things that directly went after methane.
I guess I was just wondering, are they even talking about quantifying emissions, or are they just saying, hey, look for methane and find your leaks using sensitive technology?
Oh, it
Little
gets
of both.
into how much, when do you report, how much should you capture, what technologies. There's a whole host of policy things about the what and the how much that they're arguing over.
All right, I'm pretty sure there's cookies and brownies next door, so. So thank you, we're all here, and if anybody wants to talk about the nitty-gritty and the devil in the details of the bills,
There you go again.
go ahead.